The colony dome was alive with quiet energy. Farmers adjusted hydroponic rigs as the golden glow of synthetic sunlight bathed the settlement. Below the observation deck, children's laughter echoed, their games weaving between the hum of drones. Life here felt secure, a triumph carved from the unforgiving void. Commander Alaric Voss leaned against the cool railing, scanning the bustling settlement below. His sharp gray eyes reflected the transparent dome above, where the endless black of space loomed. Everything appeared orderly, but years of service had taught him that peace rarely lasted. "Commander," Lieutenant Merrick called, his tone edged with hesitation. He stepped forward, holding a glowing data pad. "Sensors picked up something unusual." Voss turned, his jaw tightening. "Details." "3 signatures," Merrick said, swallowing. "They're inbound from the outer perimeter. Configuration unknown." Voss took the pad, studying the readout. The trajectories were controlled, deliberate. These weren't rogue asteroids or cosmic debris. His instincts flared. "Observation team, report to your stations," he ordered. "Merrick, bring up visuals. Keep civilian routines normal." "Yes, sir." Merrick moved quickly, his face pale. The observation deck door hissed open as Dr. Elias Court entered. His wiry frame contrasted with his ever-curious gaze. "Commander," Court began, adjusting his glasses. "Is this about the sensors? A stellar anomaly, perhaps?" "No," Voss said, his voice clipped. "It's intentional." Court froze. "Visitors?" "Possibly," Voss replied. He handed the pad back to Merrick, who returned with updates, his hands unsteady. "Monitor closely, and Court, double-check all dome protocols. We don't take chances." Court nodded, his curiosity fading into focus. "I'll ensure everything's airtight." Voss returned to the railing, his gaze hardening. The colony had survived too much to falter now. Every piece of this place, from its atmospheric systems to its defense network, was designed to last. But he knew better than to trust perfection. Beyond the dome, faint glimmers appeared on the horizon, slow but deliberate. They moved with purpose, their paths too precise to ignore. Voss tapped the comm on his wrist. "Observation team, updates every 5 minutes. Merrick, secure our FTL link with Earth." "Yes, Commander," came the crisp response. The dome seemed smaller under the vast darkness outside. Every instinct screamed at Voss that something was coming. It wasn't random, and it wouldn't be kind. He exhaled, gripping the railing tighter. The colony had faced challenges before, but this felt different. Whatever those ships were, they weren't here by chance. His voice hardened. "Ready the colony, Merrick. Quietly. We'll meet them on our terms." From the observation deck, the distant lights seemed to draw closer, like silent predators cutting through the void. The faint glimmers on the horizon grew larger, transforming into sleek shapes against the vast darkness. Their unnatural symmetry prickled at Voss's instincts. From the observation deck, the distant lights reflected faintly on the dome's surface, casting rippling patterns over the colony below. Voss felt the subtle vibration in the rail under his hand, an alert from the colony's mainframe, though no alarms sounded yet. Lieutenant Merrick's voice crackled in his earpiece, tension sharpening his words. "Commander, visuals are coming through. You'll want to see this." Voss stepped into the operations center, the door sliding shut behind him with a hiss. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of holographic displays. On the main screen, 3 ships hovered in perfect formation, their metallic surfaces glinting as they caught the faint starlight. Their hulls were fluid, shifting as though alive, their shapes rippling like liquid poured over invisible molds. "Analysis?" Voss's voice was calm, clipped. The colony's AI responded, its tone neutral. "Material composition unknown. Design does not match any cataloged vessels." "They're scanning us," Merrick added, his hands flying over the control panel. "Passive for now, but it's deliberate." Voss studied the image, his jaw tightening. The fluid-like ships weren't broadcasting any recognizable identifiers, no attempt at standard interstellar protocols. He leaned closer to the console, his fingertips brushing the edge of the controls. "Hail them. Wideband frequency." Static buzzed before resolving into distorted tones, alien and erratic. Words formed in fragments, their cadence strange and unfamiliar. Request, safe, landing. The room went still, every officer glancing at Voss. The distorted voice carried no malice, but its unfamiliarity gnawed at their nerves. Voss straightened. Patch it through the translator. Maximize accuracy. Marek worked quickly, beads of sweat catching the low light as they trailed down his temple. The AI processed the message, refining its translation. Moments later, a clearer response came through. We request safe landing. No harm intended. Court entered the room, his steps measured. They're not using conventional patterns. Even the syntax is off. His voice softened as he added, but it doesn't sound aggressive. Intent isn't clear, Voss replied, his tone colder. An unclear intent is a threat. The ships began a slow descent, moving closer to the colony's outer perimeter. Their motion was unnervingly smooth, their surfaces glistening like mercury as they shifted and reformed mid-flight. Voss felt the weight of their presence pressing down on the room, a silent but suffocating force. Commander, Marek said quietly, their trajectory is heading toward Pad 3, awaiting your orders. Voss's hand hovered over the console, the air around him charged with tension. He let the silence hang for a beat before answering. Grant them clearance to land on Pad 3. Lock down all other platforms. Maintain shields around civilian zones. Marek nodded, relaying the instructions. The room buzzed with subdued energy as officers moved to execute the commands. Voss turned to Court, his voice a low growl. Get a first contact team ready. I want scientists, security, and translators. And no mistakes, Doctor. This isn't a negotiation, it's survival. Court's nod was solemn, his earlier curiosity replaced by unease. Together they turned back to the screen, watching as the ships descended, their shapes shimmering against the void. Voss's gut twisted with the certainty of what he knew. Nothing about this was routine. The ships descended in an eerie ballet, their liquid metal surfaces refracting the colony's artificial light into fragmented rainbows. The edges of their hulls shimmered like the edge of a blade, sharp, yet fluid, unnervingly beautiful. Every motion was precise, deliberate, as though the vessels themselves were sentient. Commander Voss watched from the control room, the tension settling into his muscles like an unrelenting weight. The holographic display mapped their approach in real time, the ships gliding toward Pad 3. The colony's shielding flickered momentarily as the system adjusted, the faint vibration rippling through the station's infrastructure like the shiver of a distant quake. Landing protocols are live, Marek said, his voice strained but steady. He hesitated, glancing at Voss. Commander, are we certain about this clearance? Voss didn't look away from the display. Number. But until they give us a reason, we'll act as if they haven't earned one. The first ship touched down, its landing unnaturally quiet. There was no hiss of hydraulics, no mechanical groan, only the visual dissonance of its structure reshaping to stabilize itself on the platform. Sections of the hull flowed like molten silver, hardening into stabilizers that gleamed in the artificial daylight. Voss felt a subtle change in the room, the charged air pressing against his skin. The presence of the alien craft felt intrusive, as though the colony had been infiltrated not physically, but spiritually. He turned to the console. Keep the perimeter contained. Let nothing breach the second barrier. Court's voice broke the silence. If their technology extends to molecular manipulation, they may not need doors or clearances. His gaze lingered on the screen, fascination mingling with unease. They might see our walls as guidelines. We'll see how they handle locked steel, Voss said, his tone hard. And if they disregard it, we respond. The alien ship shifted again, part of its hull dissolving into an opening. A ramp formed seamlessly, like liquid glass solidifying into a perfect slope. From within, the first figure emerged. They moved like liquid spilled across uneven ground, their forms humanoid but perpetually shifting, as though they had no fixed shape. Light scattered across their surfaces, refracting like polished gemstones. The faint metallic sound of their motion was unnerving, neither entirely solid nor entirely fluid. Voss's jaw tightened as the morphid figures stepped forward, each movement smooth yet disorienting. Marek inhaled sharply. "What are they?" "Not allies," Voss muttered. He stepped closer to the window overlooking the landing platform, his presence a steadying force. The observation team stood at attention outside, their weapons concealed but ready. Scientists hovered behind them, their tools and scanners clutched tightly like shields. The lead morphid moved toward the platform's edge, its form rippling as it stopped near the colony's barrier. The shimmering figure tilted slightly, almost curiously. Then, without warning, it stretched its hand forward, pressing against the transparent dome. A sound like grinding ice filled the air as its form began to seep through the barrier. Alarms blared, red lights cascading through the room. Court stumbled back. "They're breaching the molecular structure." Voss cut him off. "Seal the secondary shield now. Move!" Below, children froze near the observation area, their small faces wide-eyed as they watched the alien intruder defy the laws of physics. Voss's chest tightened. He could feel it, the fracture, the moment something irrevocable was about to snap. The alien's hand seeped through the dome like mercury bleeding into glass, distorting the surface with each unnatural ripple. A high-pitched alarm sliced through the air, sharp and piercing, vibrating deep in the bones of every colonist. The children near the barrier stumbled back, their giggles replaced by terrified silence. One boy tripped, his small frame colliding against the base of the dome. Commander Voss barked into his comm. "Activate the secondary shield now! Evacuate the observation area immediately!" His voice was a blade cutting through the panic. The emergency shutters descended with a metallic groan, slamming down over the dome's compromised section. The light inside dimmed, casting the room into fractured shadows. The morphid figure, half submerged in the translucent material, tilted its head in an almost curious gesture, its movements fluid and alien. The grinding sound of its molecular intrusion didn't stop, resonating like nails dragged across frozen steel. "Commander, the primary seal is failing," Marek shouted, his fingers trembling over the controls. "It's destabilizing the atmospheric integrity." "Hold the line," Voss ordered, his jaw taut. "Override the auxiliary locks. Buy us time." Below, the children were herded by frantic colonists toward the evacuation routes, their faces pale and streaked with fear. But one boy, smaller than the rest, froze at the sight of the alien. Liam Varan, his father's shadow and the colony's youngest dreamer, stood as though rooted to the ground, his wide brown eyes locked on the morphid, unblinking. Voss saw him through the viewport and felt a sharp pang in his chest, as if time had paused to mock him. "Get that boy out of there," he snapped into the comm, his voice thick with urgency. Dr. Court rushed toward the internal comm station, his movements unsteady. "The child, Liam? He's right by the breach." His voice cracked, the weight of the moment breaking through his professional veneer. The morphid's liquid form pressed deeper into the dome structure. The transparent barrier gave a final, sickening groan before fracturing with a sound like splintering ice. A gust of air roared out of the breach, tearing papers from consoles and slamming workers against walls. The pressure drop hit like a punch, leaving ears ringing and lungs gasping. Liam screamed as the vacuum dragged at him, his small body tumbling toward the jagged edge of the breach. His cry was swallowed by the chaos, a fleeting sound that seemed to etch itself into Voss's memory. "Seal it," Voss roared. "Now!" The secondary barriers slammed into place, but not before Liam's fragile frame was pulled into the void, his small hand outstretched, grasping for something unseen before the vacuum consumed him entirely. The morphid stood motionless, its form shimmering as if unaware or indifferent to the devastation it had caused. Voss's hands clenched into fists, the console beneath him groaning under the force. "What have you done?" he growled, his voice low and lethal. The translation matrix crackled as the alien finally spoke, its tone detached and clinical. "Primitive matter, unable to adapt. Fascinating reaction." Voss stared at the display, his mind racing with equal parts fury and resolve. He knew, in that moment, this was no misunderstanding. This was a catalyst. and Earth's response would be anything but forgiving. The control room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the faint crackle of the translation matrix lingering in the air. Voss's hand rested on the console, the knuckles white against the harsh glow of the monitors. His mind churned, calculating, fighting the tide of anger threatening to cloud his focus. He could still see Liam's outstretched hand in the split second before the void claimed him, a memory etched in brutal clarity. Merrick broke the silence, his voice strained but steady. "Commander, secondary shields are holding, but the breach destabilized a significant portion of the dome's integrity. Atmospheric loss in adjacent sectors is minimal, but—" He hesitated. "But the damage is done," Voss finished coldly. His eyes remained fixed on the Morphid vessel displayed on the main monitor. The shimmering figures outside the platform hadn't moved. They remained eerily still, their fluid forms gleaming as though oblivious to, or worse, unbothered by, the chaos they had caused. Dr. Court approached, his steps cautious, the earlier tremor in his hands now replaced with grim determination. "We need answers, Commander. If they don't understand the gravity of their actions—" "They understand," Voss interrupted, his tone cutting. "They just don't care." The words hung heavy in the room, each syllable weighted with quiet fury. Voss straightened, his sharp gaze cutting through the tension like a blade. "Merrick, begin a silent uplink to Earth Command. Priority 1 encryption. No broadcast signals." Merrick hesitated, his hand hovering over the console. "Silent? Shouldn't we?" "We don't broadcast," Voss said, his voice unyielding. "Not yet. Let them wonder why we've gone quiet." Merrick swallowed hard and nodded, fingers flying over the controls as he initiated the uplink. The room dimmed slightly as power rerouted, the faint hum of machinery deepening into a subdued vibration underfoot. Every officer moved with deliberate purpose, their eyes flickering between monitors, waiting for a signal or an attack. Outside, the Morphid leader turned its faceless form toward the observation deck. Voss could feel its gaze, even if it had no visible eyes. It tilted its head as though studying him, its liquid frame rippling with an unnerving calm. Then it moved, stepping closer to the barrier, its metallic surface reflecting the faint light of the colony. "Commander," Court said quietly, his voice tight. "They're observing us, cataloging. They can observe all they want," Voss replied, his tone low, his eyes never leaving the screen. "They won't like what comes next." The Morphid figure raised an arm, pressing it lightly against the secondary shield. The barrier shimmered but held, the alien's movements deliberate and probing. Voss's fists clenched, the tension coiling in his chest. It wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. They were testing limits. "Commander," Merrick said, his voice breaking through the quiet. "Uplink to Earth Command is live." Voss leaned over the console, his words measured and sharp. "Patch it to my terminal. Secure the feed." His heart pounded, not with fear but with the relentless rhythm of preparation. Whatever came next, Earth would answer, not with questions, but with action. The uplink feed flickered on Voss's terminal, casting sharp, fragmented light onto his face. Earth Command's emblem spun briefly before dissolving into the stern features of Admiral Garrick, his broad frame silhouetted against the cold, sterile glow of the war room behind him. The faint murmur of activity in the background suggested preparation. Urgent. Meticulous. Garrick's steely blue eyes locked onto Voss, narrowing slightly as if the situation's gravity had already seeped through the silent transmission. "Report," Garrick demanded, his tone cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Voss stood rigid, his voice steady but low. "Unidentified alien vessels. One breached the atmospheric dome. We've lost a child. Liam Varon. Secondary shields are holding, but their technology is beyond anything we've encountered." Garrick's expression didn't falter, though a subtle shift in his jaw betrayed his restrained anger. "Casualty reports?" "Minimal," Voss replied. "But the psychological impact is immeasurable." There was a pause, heavy and deliberate, as if Garrick was weighing the implications of every word. The Admiral finally exhaled, the sound more like the growl of a predator sizing up its prey. Understood. Reinforcements are already mobilizing. You'll have full fleet support within 72 hours. Voss nodded, his gaze unwavering. They're testing us, Admiral. They know the limits of our defenses now. We need to assume they'll escalate. Then don't give them the chance, Garrick said sharply. Maintain containment, Commander. Keep them in the dark. We'll bring the storm. The transmission cut abruptly, leaving the room in tense silence. Voss turned back to the console, the residual glow fading from his features. Behind him, Marek shifted nervously, his eyes darting between the monitors and the commander. 72 hours, Marek said, his voice barely above a whisper. Can we hold that long? We don't have a choice, Voss answered, his tone firm. He stepped away from the console, the weight of command pressing heavily on his shoulders. His gaze swept the room, landing on each officer in turn. Focus. We locked this place down tighter than it's ever been. No signals, no movements they can trace. Let them wonder why the prey isn't running. Outside, the Morphid vessels remained motionless, their shimmering hulls reflecting the dim light of the colony. The lead alien stood near the shield, its liquid form shifting subtly, almost imperceptibly, as though listening to vibrations in the air. It moved with deliberate grace, stepping back from the barrier and retreating toward its ship. Commander, Court said cautiously, breaking the quiet. They're withdrawing, at least for now. Voss's gaze hardened. Not withdrawing, regrouping. The Morphid ships began to rise, their fluid exteriors rippling with faint light as they ascended. The motion was hypnotic, yet deeply unsettling, like watching an apex predator circle its prey. The colony's automated systems tracked every movement, the data streams flowing across the monitors like rivers of light. As the ships hovered above the platform, their silent presence lingered like a shadow over the colony. Voss's gut twisted. This wasn't over. It was the beginning of something far worse, and every second counted. The Morphid ships hung in the sky like a still painting, their reflective surfaces glinting faintly as if mocking the faint, flickering lights of the colony below. Voss stood by the observation deck's reinforced window, the faint vibration of the colony's structural reinforcements beneath his boots reminding him how fragile their sanctuary truly was. The ship's retreat had left a strange void, one that buzzed with unspoken tension, like the silence before an avalanche. Commander, I've enhanced our sensor data, Marek called from the console, his voice tight. Their energy output has spiked. It's not consistent with withdrawal patterns. It's something else. Voss turned, his sharp gaze locking on the screen. The energy readings pulsed in erratic bursts, jagged waves that painted the display in ominous shades of red and gold. They were too calculated to be random, yet too chaotic to decipher. The Morphid were preparing, but for what? Keep tracking it, Voss said, his voice a steel edge. Alert me the moment they cross into actionable range. Marek gave a brisk nod and dove back into his work, his hands moving with precision over the console. Beside him, Court lingered, his face pale but his eyes focused, scanning the data with the haunted look of someone who knew they were staring at something beyond understanding. It's almost musical, Court murmured under his breath, his brow furrowed. Their energy spikes. They follow no obvious rhythm, yet there's a symmetry to it, like a language we can't hear. Voss stepped closer to the console, his jaw tightening as he studied the oscillating patterns. Language or not, it's a signal, to each other or to someone else. He straightened, the weight of realization settling in his chest. The Morphid weren't simply regrouping, they were coordinating. His thoughts turned cold and methodical, stripping away emotion and honing in on the strategy. Whatever their next move was, it would be calculated, and they wouldn't leave it to chance. Outside, the air around the ships began to shimmer faintly, as if the fabric of space itself was warping. The light twisted in strange patterns, bending around their forms in a way that made them seem both impossibly close and incomprehensibly far. A low, resonant hum thrummed through the reinforced walls, not mechanical but something deeper, primal, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Commander, Marek's voice broke through the tension, a note of panic creeping in. The readings, They're converging. Whatever they're doing, it's accelerating. Defensive systems online, Voss ordered sharply. Prepare the secondary turrets. I want targeting locks primed, but do not fire until I give the order. Court stepped forward hesitantly. If we fire first, we won't, Voss cut him off, but we won't let them think we're defenseless either. Through the viewport, the Morphid ships began to shift again, their forms rippling as though responding to some unseen conductor. The shimmering intensified and the light twisted into spirals, casting distorted reflections across the colony below. Voss's gut twisted. They weren't merely testing limits anymore. They were laying groundwork for something far more deliberate. The question was whether the colony had the time to figure out what. The shimmering spirals of light above the Morphid ships twisted with an almost hypnotic rhythm, casting refracted patterns across the colony's dome. The air within the observation deck grew heavy, laden with the unshakable sense that something profound and dangerous was unfolding. Every pulse of energy from the ships seemed to resonate deeper, pressing into the minds of those who watched, like an unseen hand nudging them toward the precipice of understanding. Voss's gaze locked on the alien vessels, his fingers gripping the edge of the console. The Morphid's motions, fluid and deliberate, defied every strategic playbook he'd studied. They weren't following patterns he could predict, and that alone set his instincts on edge. Merrick's updates crackled through the tense silence, his tone sharpened by urgency. Energy convergence nearing its peak, Commander. Their outputs escalating exponentially. No clear precedent for this behavior. Voss clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Have the targeting locks ready. If they cross the defensive threshold— They haven't yet, Court interrupted, his voice tight but measured. They're still holding position. They're not holding, Voss snapped, turning to face him. They're preparing. The deck's lights flickered as another surge rippled through the colony's systems. A deep vibration hummed in the floor beneath them, resonating through the metal and bone alike. The Morphid were exerting a presence more than physical, something deeper, intangible. It felt like the air itself recoiled from their energy, twisting under a weight it wasn't meant to bear. Outside, the spirals of light condensed, shrinking inward toward the ships. The dazzling fractals of energy became sharper, their patterns etched into the dark void like molten threads of gold. Then, abruptly, the display shifted. A single beam of concentrated light lanced from the lead Morphid ship, striking the shielded barrier of the colony. The impact wasn't an explosion, but a distortion, like a ripple through water that left the air rippling in its wake. Shield integrity dropping, 80%, Merrick called, his fingers flying across the console. They're not firing to breach, it's targeted interference. Then they're testing limits again, Voss growled, but they won't break us this time. Court leaned forward, scanning the chaotic readouts. Their technology, it's manipulating energy fields at a molecular level. They're not just testing the shield, they're rewriting it. Not on my watch, Voss said, his voice hard. Reroute auxiliary power to reinforce the outer grid. Make them fight for every inch. The Morphid ships pulsed with renewed energy, their shimmering forms expanding and contracting as though drawing breath. The lead vessel emitted a low-frequency vibration that seemed to hum in the chest more than the ears, a dissonant note that made the hairs on the back of every neck stand on end. The shield shimmered, its once stable surface now flickering like a fragile veil. Voss's stomach churned. The Morphid weren't retreating or attacking, they were deconstructing, testing how far they could unravel humanity's defenses before striking decisively. Commander, Merrick said, his voice a quiet tremor. If they're this deliberate now, what happens when they stop holding back? Voss didn't answer. His focus remained on the display, his mind a storm of possibilities. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be cautious. The shield flickered like a dying flame, the once impenetrable barrier trembling under the relentless pressure of the Morphid's energy manipulation. Every pulse of their alien technology pressed harder, bending the colony's defenses like a bowstring stretched to its limit. Voss stood rooted before the console, his sharp gaze flicking between the readouts and the shimmering vessels beyond the dome. He could feel the weight of the moment settle in his chest, as if the colony itself were holding its breath. Marek's voice broke through the tension, hoarse from shouting over the alarms. "Commander, shield integrity is down to 50%. They're destabilizing the molecular lattice. At this rate, they'll breach within minutes." Voss's jaw tightened, his mind racing through contingencies. Redirect power from the secondary grids. Divert all non-essential systems to the shield. Lights, atmosphere regulators, everything. "That'll leave some sectors vulnerable," Marek warned, his fingers flying across the controls. "Better a blackout than total collapse," Voss snapped. "Do it!" The lights dimmed in an instant, plunging the observation deck into a muted glow cast only by the holographic screens. The temperature dropped and a thin sheen of frost began to form on the reinforced windows as the regulators struggled against the diverted energy. Outside, the Morphid ships loomed like predators circling prey, their reflective surfaces casting distorted shadows over the colony below. Court leaned forward, his breath visible in the chilled air. His voice was low, almost trembling. "They're not just breaking the shield, they're learning how it's built, studying it. This isn't an attack, it's a dissection." "Then we don't give them the time to finish," Voss growled. He turned to Marek. "Status on Earth Command's reinforcements?" Marek hesitated, his expression tense. "Still 60 hours out, sir." Voss's eyes narrowed. 60 hours was an eternity in a battle measured in seconds. His grip tightened on the console as he glanced back at the Morphid vessels. Their pulsing energy patterns seemed to quicken, growing more erratic yet precise. It was like watching a predator play with its food, testing how far it could push before the kill. A sudden flash erupted from the lead ship, sending a shockwave through the shield. The vibration rippled through the floor, rattling loose panels and sending a cascade of sparks from a nearby console. Marek flinched, shielding his face. 40%! Commander, it's not holding! "Focus!" Voss barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. He turned to Court, his expression cold and calculating. "We need leverage. If they're dissecting us, then we turn the tables. What can we exploit?" Court's eyes darted to the readouts, his mind working furiously. "Their energy pulses, they're synchronized like a network. If we disrupt the connection, even for a moment, then they lose their advantage," Voss finished, his voice low but steady. He straightened, his gaze hard as iron. "Marek, prepare a targeted EMP burst. Court, find the synchronization frequency and feed it into the targeting array." The room erupted into controlled chaos as the team moved into action. Voss turned back to the viewport, his eyes fixed on the Morphid ships. They thought they were in control, but they didn't know humanity's resilience, or what it would cost them to underestimate it. The observation deck buzzed with focused tension as the colony's systems groaned under the strain of the Morphid assault. Voss paced beside the primary console, his sharp gaze fixed on the holographic display that mapped the alien vessels in real time. Their shimmering forms pulsed with synchronized energy, a relentless rhythm that seemed to taunt the faltering shield with every beat. "EMP, burst ready, Commander," Marek said, his voice tight as his fingers hovered over the controls. The console cast flickering shadows across his pale face. "We've isolated their synchronization frequency, but there's no guarantee it'll hold for long." "It doesn't need to hold," Voss said, his voice low and firm. "It just needs to disrupt them long enough to buy us time." Court stood by, his arms crossed as his breath curled visibly in the frigid air. "Their network is adaptive. If we miscalculate, it could strengthen their connection instead of breaking it." "That's a risk we don't have the luxury of avoiding," Voss snapped, not taking his eyes off the display. "If we sit idle, they'll take us apart molecule by molecule. This buys us a chance to turn the game." The Morphid ships pulsed again, their energy patterns growing more erratic, as if sensing the colony's desperation. A ripple passed through the shield, visible as a faint distortion that blurred the stars beyond the dome. Voss felt the vibration in the floor beneath his boots, subtle but insistent, like the ticking of an unseen clock. "Target locked," Marek said, his fingers trembling slightly as he keyed in the final command. "On your word, sir." Voss exhaled slowly, his breath steadying the storm in his chest. His voice was a blade when he spoke. "Do it!" Marek's fingers danced over the controls, and a sharp whine filled the air as the colony's targeting system fired the EMP burst. The room vibrated with the raw force of the discharge, a tangible wave of energy that rippled outward like a crack of thunder. The lights dimmed further, plunging the deck into a shadowed haze as auxiliary systems struggled to compensate. Outside, the Morphid ships shuddered violently. Their once fluid forms spasmed, their synchronized pulses faltering into chaos. The dazzling spirals of energy around them fractured, breaking into jagged shards of light that scattered across the void like shattered glass. "It's working!" Marek called out, his voice breaking with relief. "Their connection is destabilizing!" Voss stepped closer to the viewport, his eyes narrowing as he watched the Morphid vessels writhe. Their sleek symmetry was gone, replaced by disjointed movements that seemed almost panicked. For the first time, they looked vulnerable. "Don't celebrate yet," Voss said, his tone harsh but measured. "Monitor their systems. If they readapt, we won't get another chance." Court leaned over a secondary console, analyzing the Morphid response. His brow furrowed. "They're trying to recalibrate, but the disruption hit deeper than expected. Their movements, they're not coordinated anymore." A sudden jolt shook the deck, a low, guttural vibration that made the reinforced panels creak. Voss's stomach knotted as a realization struck him. The Morphid weren't retreating. They were preparing something far more dangerous. "Marek," he barked, his voice sharp, "bring up the external readings now." The display flickered, revealing a surge of energy building within the largest Morphid ship. It wasn't chaotic anymore. It was deliberate, focused. "They're escalating," Court murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've learned enough," Voss said grimly, his voice hard as steel. "Now, they're preparing to strike." The holographic display burned bright against the dimly lit room, casting jagged reflections on the tense faces of Voss and his team. The largest Morphid vessel, previously disjointed and writhing, now pulsed with alarming focus. The energy signature displayed on Marek's console spiked with dangerous precision, the chaotic readings narrowing into sharp, deliberate lines. "They're consolidating power," Marek reported, his voice clipped, panic just barely suppressed. "Whatever they're about to do, it's not a countermeasure. It's an attack." Voss's jaw tightened, his eyes locked on the ship as though sheer force of will could unravel their plan. The Morphid vessel no longer appeared unstable. Its rippling liquid surface gleamed with intent, every shift purposeful, every motion unnervingly efficient. "They're not scattering this time," Court said, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "They're building toward something singular. It's focused, directed." He leaned over the secondary console, his fingers tapping rapidly. "They've adapted faster than anything we've seen. If they launch this—" "They won't get the chance," Voss interrupted, his voice cold as iron. His gaze swept the room. "Status on our secondary defenses?" Marek didn't meet his eyes. 70% operational, but they're designed for smaller-scale engagements. If that energy surge hits the colony—" "It won't," Voss said sharply, cutting off the thought before it could spiral. He turned to Court. "What's their weak point? You said they're networked. Is that central ship controlling the others?" Court nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, but disrupting that core again won't stop the energy buildup. It's self-contained now." Voss's mind raced, threading possibilities like a needle through fabric. The Morphid weren't testing limits anymore. They were preparing to eradicate them entirely. He turned back to the display, watching the largest ship pulse with a sinister rhythm. The energy around it twisted the space nearby, bending light into sharp, unnatural arcs. It was no longer a threat to be contained. It was a weapon primed to fire. "Marek!" Voss barked. "Target the core vessel. Concentrate all remaining firepower on that ship. I don't care if it drains our reserves. Take it out before they finish charging." Marek hesitated only for a second before his hands moved over the console. The targeting grid locked onto the Morphid core ship, the colony's turrets recalibrating with a low, resonant vibration. Voss could feel the tension in the room thicken, the weight of what hung in the balance pressing into every corner of the deck. The first salvo launched, streaking through the darkness like jagged bolts of lightning. The Morphid ship's exterior rippled in response, absorbing the initial impact. For a moment it seemed to falter, its energy signature dipping as the ripple effect spread across its liquid surface. But then the ship retaliated. A pulse of raw power erupted from its core, slamming into the colony's already weakened shield. The impact sent a shockwave through the station, throwing Marek against the console and sending sparks cascading from the overhead panels. Voss gritted his teeth as he braced against the sudden jolt, his ears ringing with the force of it. "The shield's at 20%, Marek shouted, his voice strained. "One more hit like that." "They're accelerating the charge," Court cut in, his tone grim. "If we can't stop them now—" Voss stared at the Morphid vessel, its energy spiraling toward an apex, and knew they had seconds left to act. The colony's survival teetered on the edge of a knife. They had one shot to stop it, or to fall with it. The colony trembled under the escalating assault. The Morphid vessel's energy output surged, its luminous core swirling like a vortex of molten light. The once chaotic pulses had sharpened into an unnerving tempo, steady and implacable, like the ticking of a countdown to oblivion. Voss gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white as he absorbed the chaos unfolding around him. "Shield at 15%. Marek's voice cracked, his fingers darting across the controls. His face was drenched in sweat, glistening in the pale glow of the readouts. "We can't hold another direct hit." "Then we don't let them fire again," Voss said, his voice hard and steady. He turned to Court, who was frantically analyzing the Morphid's energy patterns. "Options? Now." Court's jaw tightened as his eyes flickered over the data. "The core ship, it's channeling all the energy into that singularity. If we destabilize the buildup mid-charge, it could collapse in on itself." "And take them out," Voss finished, his tone grim. "What do we need?" "Precision," Court replied, his voice thin. "We'd have to strike the energy core itself, but with our targeting systems compromised—" "Figure it out," Voss snapped. "We don't have time for perfection." Outside, the Morphid ship swelled with light, its shimmering surface now an iridescent storm of shifting hues. The air inside the observation deck grew heavy, charged with the ambient energy radiating from the display. The vibration in the floor intensified, resonating like a heartbeat growing faster, louder, and dangerously erratic. "Commander, the auxiliary batteries are drained," Marek said, his voice taut with panic. "We've got one volley left, maybe two, before we're defenseless." Voss didn't hesitate. "Load everything we've got, target the core. If we miss, we're finished anyway." Marek's hands flew over the controls, his movements mechanical yet desperate. The targeting system blinked on the screen, struggling to maintain a lock as the Morphid's energy warped the surrounding space. The room filled with the sharp scent of overheated circuits as the console strained against the colony's dwindling power reserves. "Target locked," Marek called out, his voice shaking. "But their energy field is fluctuating. It's throwing off the calibration." Voss stepped closer to the viewport, his gaze fixed on the Morphid ship. Its pulsating core burned brighter with each second, casting shifting shadows across the deck. He could feel the pressure in the air, the impending release of unimaginable force. "Fire," he ordered, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The final volley launched, streaking through the void like spears of light. The projectiles sliced through the Morphid's warped energy field, the first few dissipating harmlessly against its rippling surface. But the final round struck true, piercing the glowing core. For a fraction of a second, the Morphid ship froze, its form flickering like a disrupted signal. Then, with a soundless explosion, the core imploded, light twisted inward, collapsing into a blinding singularity that swallowed the vessel whole. The surrounding ships recoiled, their energy signatures faltering. Marek stared at the screen, his chest heaving. "Direct hit! They're destabilizing!" Voss didn't move, his eyes locked on the display as the remaining ships began to drift, their once synchronized movements now erratic. "It's not over," he muttered, his voice low. "They're adapting. This was just a test." The holographic display flickered with the fragmented remnants of the Morphid fleet's movements. Their synchronized grace was gone, replaced by erratic patterns as the ships struggled to recalibrate after the loss of their core vessel. Voss's eyes narrowed, tracing the shifting trajectories with a calculating intensity. The Morphid weren't retreating. They were regrouping, adapting as they always did. "Status on their energy signatures?" Voss asked. His voice clipped as he turned toward Marek. Marek scanned the console, his fingers steady now that adrenaline had taken hold. "Their output is fluctuating, but it's stabilizing fast. The smaller vessels are redirecting their power flow to compensate for the core's destruction." Voss nodded sharply. "They're redistributing their network. We've rattled them, but not enough. They're adjusting faster than we can hit them." Court leaned over another station, his voice taut but analytical. "If they're using a decentralized system now, we need to target their connections, not the ships themselves. Break the web before they weave it back together." "That's a theory," Voss said, turning to face him fully. "I need a plan, something actionable." Court gestured toward the Morphid trajectories on the display. "Their movements aren't random. They're shifting into a new formation, likely to rebuild the network. If we can predict the structure, we could intercept key nodes before they're operational." Marek interjected, his voice steadying. "Our long-range turrets can cover multiple trajectories, but we'll need precise timing. If even one node goes active, the network could stabilize, and they'll overwhelm us." Voss considered this, his mind churning through possibilities. "What's our power reserve?" "Minimal," Marek replied. "We can manage a coordinated strike, but it'll drain what's left of the grid." "Then we don't miss," Voss said, his tone firm. He turned to the room. "We split our firepower. Marek, set the turrets to anticipate their movements. Court, use the last scan of their network as a reference. Identify potential weak points." Court hesitated. "If we miscalculate—" "We won't," Voss cut him off. "Focus on the patterns. They're predictable in their logic. Exploit that." The room buzzed with controlled urgency as the team worked, their movements efficient despite the mounting pressure. Voss's gaze flicked to the viewport. Outside, the Morphid ships moved like restless predators, their shifting forms catching the faint light in sharp, glinting patterns. The air in the observation deck seemed to thicken with the weight of what was to come. "Commander," Court said finally, his voice breaking through the tense silence, "I've marked 3 critical nodes. If we hit them simultaneously, it'll disrupt their reconstruction." Voss stepped closer to the console, studying the highlighted points on the display. The ships were aligning rapidly, their motions deliberate. "Marek, input those coordinates into the targeting system. Prepare all remaining turrets." "Yes, sir," Marek replied, his hands flying over the controls. Voss straightened, his voice cutting through the tension. "This is it. One coordinated strike. If we succeed, we cripple their network. If we fail—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The targeting systems locked onto the nodes, the countdown ticking in sharp digital bursts. Voss's pulse quickened as the final seconds approached. His voice was calm, unyielding. "Fire!" The colony's defensive turrets roared to life, each projectile streaking across the void like molten arrows. The targeted Morphid nodes shimmered in response, their liquid metal forms pulsing as the alien network strained under the sudden barrage. Every strike sent shockwaves rippling across the ship's surfaces, disrupting their once synchronized movements. "Direct hit on Node 1, Marek announced, his voice tight with focus. The holographic display lit up with a cascade of data as the first Morphid node faltered, its energy output collapsing into erratic bursts. "Node 2 is destabilizing," Court added, his eyes locked on the readout. "They're trying to compensate by rerouting power to Node 3. "They're faster than expected," Voss muttered, his tone sharp. "Adjust the targeting grid. Don't give them time to reinforce." Marek's fingers flew over the controls, recalibrating the turrets to track the shifting Morphid vessels. The targeting systems hummed with strain, their algorithms pushed to their limits as they calculated the erratic trajectories of the alien ships. "Firing solution updated," Marek said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Turrets ready to engage Node 3. "Do it," Voss commanded, his gaze fixed on the viewport. Outside, the Morphid fleet glowed with chaotic energy, their liquid forms rippling as they scrambled to maintain their crumbling network. The colony's final volley struck with surgical precision, the projectiles converging on the third node in a blinding cascade of light. The Morphid vessel shuddered violently, its energy field fracturing into jagged shards that scattered across the void like shattered glass. For a brief moment, the entire fleet seemed to freeze, their movements halting as the severed network collapsed. "Connection disrupted," Court reported, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. "They've lost coordination." Voss didn't let his guard down. "Marek, confirm all nodes are offline." Marek scanned the console, his brow furrowing. "Nodes 1 and 2 are completely neutralized. Node 3's energy signature is fading, but it's not fully extinguished. They might still recover." "Not if we press the advantage," Voss said, his tone firm. "Redirect all remaining power to the turrets. Target any vessel attempting to re-establish the network." Court hesitated. "Commander, that'll leave the colony's internal systems vulnerable. If they counter—" "They won't get the chance," Voss cut him off, his voice hard. "This is our window. We finish this now." The team moved with practiced efficiency, their hands steady despite the mounting tension. The colony's turrets roared again, each strike precise and unrelenting. The Morphid vessels, no longer synchronized, moved chaotically, their fluid forms flickering with erratic pulses of light. "2 ships are retreating," Marek reported, his voice rising with urgency. "The others are scattering." "They're breaking," Voss said, his gaze narrowing. "Target the retreating ships. Ensure they don't regroup." The final salvo struck true, the retreating ships disintegrating into glowing fragments. The remaining Morphid vessels drifted aimlessly, their once imposing presence reduced to scattered wreckage. Voss exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing as the holographic display cleared of active threats. But his mind remained sharp, his instincts warning him that this victory was only the first step in a far larger conflict. "Keep monitoring for residual energy signatures," he ordered. "We're not done yet." The fractured remnants of the Morphid fleet drifted like ghosts across the void, their once flawless symmetry shattered into chaos. Voss stood at the observation deck, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the scattered debris flicker against the darkness. The hollow silence in the room pressed against his thoughts, yet his mind remained sharp, calculating. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Marek's voice broke through the tension, steady but laced with weariness. "Commander, residual energy signatures are fading. No immediate threats detected." Voss didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the viewport. The Morphid had underestimated humanity, treating them as a fragile anomaly in the galactic tapestry. That arrogance had cost them their advantage, but it was a mistake they wouldn't make twice. "They'll come back," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "And when they do, they'll be ready for us." Court stepped forward hesitantly, his face pale and drawn. "We've dealt them a significant blow, Commander. Their network is destroyed, their fleet scattered. It'll take time for them to recover." Voss turned, his sharp eyes meeting Court's. "Time is irrelevant to a species that can rewrite its own biology. They adapt faster than we can prepare. Every second they're out there, they're learning." Court fell silent, the weight of Voss's words sinking into the room like a lead weight. The observation deck felt colder, the faint vibrations of the colony's strained systems humming beneath their feet. Voss broke the silence with a tone as sharp as steel. "Send the report to Earth Command. Tell them this was a victory, but not a triumph. They need to see what we're up against." Marek hesitated. "And what about the rest of the galaxy? Do we—" "No," Voss cut in, his voice razor-edged. "We tell no one else. The Morphid aren't just our enemy, they're everyone's. But if the galaxy sees us falter even for a moment, they'll turn on us too." Court's brow furrowed. "Commander, if they misunderstand our silence, it could escalate." "Good," Voss said, his tone colder than the vacuum outside. "Let them fear us. Let them wonder why the Morphid failed to break us when they tore through others without resistance. Fear will buy us time, and time is our greatest weapon." The deck fell quiet again as Voss turned back to the viewport. His eyes scanned the stars, his thoughts racing ahead to battles yet to come. Behind him, Marek spoke softly, almost hesitantly. Do you think they understand, Commander? What they provoked? Voss's lips pressed into a thin line, his voice steady and unyielding. They will. Soon they'll learn what it means to harm one of ours. The faint glow of distant debris flickered against the dome, the dying embers of a conflict that had ignited something far greater. Voss straightened, his voice cutting through the silence with the weight of finality. We're not fragile. We're not expendable. And when they come for us again, we'll remind them of the lesson they chose to forget. The colony was quiet now, the eerie calm settling over the settlement like the stillness after a storm. Voss remained at the observation deck, the faint glow of the distant stars reflecting off his weathered features. The debris field drifted in the void, a silent reminder of the battle they had just survived. But Voss's expression didn't soften. His victory wasn't one he would celebrate. It was a message, and the galaxy would hear it soon enough. Marek approached, his footsteps measured, his voice low. Commander, the report to Earth Command has been sent. Reinforcements are en route. They'll arrive within 24 hours. Voss gave a faint nod, his gaze never leaving the stars. Good. Make sure the defensive systems are recalibrated before they get here. Every weakness we expose today must be sealed. Marek hesitated, glancing at the dark expanse outside the dome. Do you think the Morphid will strike again this soon? They won't have to, Voss replied, his tone sharp, deliberate. The damage they inflicted wasn't just physical. They made us bleed, and that's enough for them to plan their next move. But when they come back, they won't find us the same. Court stepped in, his voice quieter than usual. Do you believe they understood why we fought so hard? Why we refused to let them win? Voss turned to face him, his eyes steeled with conviction. They don't understand yet. They see us as primitive, limited by our rigid forms, by our need to protect each other. To them, a child is nothing more than potential energy, another fragment of existence. They can't comprehend what it means to lose something irreplaceable. Court glanced down, his hands tightening around the edge of the console. But they will. They will, Voss echoed, his voice resonating with the weight of certainty. Because this isn't just a fight for survival. It's a fight for what makes us human. The lights of the colony flickered briefly as the backup system stabilized. In the silence that followed, the faint sounds of repair crews echoed through the halls. The colonists worked tirelessly, driven not by fear, but by something deeper, a quiet, unyielding resolve. Voss turned back to the viewport, his voice lowering as though speaking directly to the void. The Morphid thought they could break us because we were smaller, because we were different. They didn't realize that difference is our strength. They didn't realize what it means to take one of our own. Marek's voice was steady as he spoke, his words carrying the same quiet power. And now they do. The commander's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his hands clasped behind his back. We don't just endure, we rise. They killed one of ours, and now the galaxy will know. There's nothing more dangerous than a species that loves its own so fiercely it will turn the stars against you. The quiet settled again, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was a promise, a silent vow that humanity would never let the loss of a child go unanswered. And as the colony's lights brightened, the galaxy beyond seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm that would follow.